So what are PFAS and why do we care about them? The main takeaway is that PFAS are a diverse group of contaminants. They're everywhere. They persist for a long time in the environment and they're toxic. So we estimate that there's over 15,000 different PFAS chemicals in this family. I have an example of one here. The sort of defining characteristic is that they have a carbon-fluorine bond in them. And that's one of the strongest bonds in chemistry, which means that it's difficult to break down, and that's why these get called forever chemicals. PFAS are found in everyday products. They're in pretty much anything you buy that's water resistant or stain proof. So your rain jackets, your nonstick pans. They're also in things like waterproof mascara and long-lasting lipstick. And then they're also in industrial products, most notably firefighting foam. And we care about this because they've been linked to a lot of different human health effects on multiple systems. So they have reproductive effects, they have endocrine effects, they've been associated with various kinds of cancers. So it's really been a growing public health concern. And what are the routes of exposure to humans? So there's three main routes. Most commonly, we think of ingestion. So this can be through drinking water or through food. We can also inhale PFAS. This often happens if you have an occupational exposure. So if you work in a factory that's producing or using PFAS, it can vaporize and you can inhale it through your lungs. But there's growing research that there can also be PFAS in things like indoor dust. And then the last exposure route that we know less about is that PFAS can penetrate your skin barrier. And so things like those cosmetic products that I was talking about, if there's PFAS in those, some proportion of the chemical can actually go through the skin and get into your body that way. And where are PFAS in the environment? The short answer is everywhere. They are in the water, they're found on land, and they're even found in the air. So we find them in surface water, in drinking water, in fish. We also find them in the biosolids and fertilizers that are applied to agricultural lands. Then they can run off the landscape and either get into streams or be used in like our households. We wash products that have PFAS, it goes to a wastewater treatment plant. The treatment plant can't remove the PFAS and then it gets into the stream that way. We also see things where PFAS can be produced and then there's air emissions of that PFAS into the atmosphere. It can transport. So it really cycles and goes everywhere. And since we're a fisheries group here tonight, how do they get into fish? And there's sort of two main processes that we think about of how PFAS enter fish, and really all contaminants. The first is bioaccumulation. And so this is the concept that an animal can ingest or be exposed to PFAS or a contaminant at a faster rate than it's able to excrete it from its body. So many of you maybe drink coffee or tea in the morning. The caffeine that you ingest only lasts in your system for maybe 6 hours, maybe more, maybe less. But PFAS stays in the system for a lot longer. And so it builds up over time. And then the other process is biomagnification. And this happens as we move through the trophic levels. So one insect, for example, eats lots of plants. And each of those plants has a small amount of PFAS in it. And all of those amounts of PFAS sum up into the insect that consumes them. And so forth and so on up the food chain. So then you have things like apex predators with very high levels. And so some people might recall the DDT pesticide getting into eagles at very high concentrations and affecting their ability to lay their eggs. It was back in the 70s. Okay, so we're all interested in fish, and we're also all in the Lake Michigan region. So one thing we can ask is, are the PFAS just in the lake, or are they also in the tributaries? And this is some data from our group that we sampled the last 2 years, so 2023 and 2024, at the multiple tributaries that go into Lake Michigan. And we found PFAS in all of these watersheds. The larger circles indicate more PFAS overall. And then the different colors are different individual PFAS compounds. So we see overall larger amounts of PFAS in more developed and industrialized areas, and less in the more eastern portion of the watersheds. None of the water samples exceeded the levels that are considered harmful for fish or harmful for wildlife. But there were some sites that exceeded what the EPA deemed safe for human consumption. So there were things that would be too high to be safe for people. And then interestingly, so we sampled all of these sites. We've gone back to 10 of them this past fall and have collected over 400 biological samples. So everything from algae and leaves, base of the food web, to aquatic invertebrates and fish. And we're in the process of prepping and analyzing all those fish. So we'll see how the PFAS moves from the water and the sediment into those biological compartments. That's ongoing. Okay, and so why do we find them all over Northwest Indiana? The main driver of this is us, humans. So more human development means more PFAS. These are things that are in our products that we use at home or to produce products at industrial facilities. And it's really spread through a wastewater treatment plant. So more human development, more use of PFAS, and then more volume going out into the environment. We also have a pretty strong industrial border in Northwest Indiana and surrounding airfields. So you've probably heard military bases and airports being sort of hotspots for PFAS contamination. That's because it's really important for personnel to be able to put out a fire if there's jet fuel involved, but it means they're practicing doing those safety procedures with PFAS and firefighting foams, and then that can leach down into the groundwater and get into our environment that way. And like I mentioned in the first slide, these can be transported through the atmosphere. So even if we eliminated all PFAS in our products and all the industry that uses PFAS stopped in Northern Indiana, we would still see PFAS because it comes from other places, both across the country and really across the globe. Okay, so I'm going to tee up a little bit more of our work and then invite my mentor Gary up to talk about some results in fish. But over the last 5 to 7 years, our lab has been very focused on measuring PFAS in the Great Lakes region, particularly in aquatic ecosystems. And one big sampling effort that we've done has been in collaboration with USGS and US Fish and Wildlife. We've collected prey fish, so alewife, bloater, round goby, and then both deep water and slimy sculpin from these 6 areas of Lake Michigan. These are collected by the USGS bottom trawls. And we have over 100 fish, 117 fish, prey fish collected from that sampling effort. And we've also collected predator fish, so lake trout, chinook, coho, and steelhead, through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife mass marking program. So these are fish that are collected by anglers, so they would be of interest to be eaten. And the anglers, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife personnel will come around and ask, hey, can we take a small sample of your fillet? And I think they offer to do the cleaning for the anglers. And so that happens in these 4 quadrants of the lake. And we have actually more than 87 fish, but Gary is going to talk to you about those 87.
Thanks, Alison. Before she leaves the stage, I just want to mention that this is Dr. Alison Zachritz here, and she's a graduate a year ago from the University of Notre Dame. I had the privilege of being her PhD mentor here, and she's a postdoctorate in our group now. So she's working for another year with us on PFAS projects. So thank you, Alison, for teeing this up. And she knows a lot more about PFAS than I do. So we're tag teaming this here today. I'm Gary Lamberti, so I'm a professor at the University of Notre Dame. I'm glad you're all here today. So I'm going to present some good news and some bad news about PFAS in our Lake Michigan fisheries. And this is kind of a microcosm of the world in a sense, because these chemicals are everywhere, as Alison has said, and permeate a lot of our ecological systems. So she mentioned these 200 or so fish that we analyzed for PFAS. I could get into how we analyze them, but you'd just be bored by that. So I just want you to kind of take note of these different species here. So these are plots of the concentrations, or we sometimes call it the body burden of PFAS within this fish. So, and the different colors represent different compounds. So it's kind of a cocktail of different PFAS compounds. Alison mentioned that there are 15,000 of these about in the environment. We can only analyze at our lab about 40 of them. And other labs can do maybe up to 100 maximally, but it's the tip of the iceberg. So the ones we can actually analyze are the tip of the PFAS iceberg. So keep that in mind too. 40, maybe 70, maybe 100 out of 15,000. So, and then this blue one right here is one of the most prevalent compounds in the environment, and that's called PFAS. So keep in mind, there's PFAS, which is the family of these compounds, and then PFAS is only one of those. There was a lot of reduction of PFAS historically. I'll get to the fact that it's been phased out now. But it's still a forever chemical, so it's still out there, even though it's not being produced anymore for good reasons. But notice how most of these fish listed here are dominated by this one compound, PFAS. But there are other things too. The other thing to notice is that these sculpin, anyone know anything about sculpin, about where they live? They're on the bottom. So they're living on the bottom of the lake. And so they're right up against the sediments, which is a trap for PFAS. So the sediments, these PFAS chemicals bind to the sediments, stored on those very readily. And so it's like a filter for them. And so these sculpin right here, this one's off the chart. This is a different scale. This is up to 200 parts per billion. The others, the scale is only up to 35. So keep that in mind. So these sculpin, first of all, are loaded with PFAS, about half of which is PFAS. Okay, so if you think about prey fish for things like salmon that Rob rears, and you look at alewife, a very important prey fish for things like Chinook and other salmonids. These are bloaters, and these are this is round goby, another invasive right here, and so as well as alewife. But these have modest levels of PFAS within them, again, dominated by PFAS. And then what we see is, right, biomagnification. So the predator fish, salmon, lake trout, this is the only native one here, rainbow trout, steelhead, another name for steelheads, coho salmon right here also have, moderate levels of PFAS in their bodies, again, dominated by this one compound, PFAS. But notice that we go from prey fish to higher levels of predator fish because of this bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So let's think about eating these fish and what that means. So we want to think about now, we know that these compounds are in our salmonids. That's just a fact of life. And it's not unique to the Great Lakes. Everywhere on the planet, big fish have higher burdens of PFAS and other contaminants as well. So let's compare this to consumption advisories. So what this means is that if you were to eat one fish serving per week, an 8-ounce fillet, for example, what's safe to eat? So these lines represent safety levels for different criteria and different organizations over time. And we call these violin plots because they kind of look like a violin or a cello. All that means is that these right here, which are Chinook or king salmon, most of the individuals are sitting right here in the sort of fat part of this diagram for their concentration of PFAS, again in parts per billion. So this is just the one compound, the nasty one, PFAS. So this one, are kind of sitting down here. Here are coho right here, so they're lower, predominantly than our big, long-lived king salmon right here. And then lake trout, which are pretty long-lived as well, are sitting at about right here, most of the individuals. And then all three of them combined are kind of show this diagram right here. So some of them are higher, a few of them, most of them are sitting down here. Very few have almost no or non-detectable PFAS levels. Okay, so with that, these are the criteria or the advisories in terms of, okay, if you eat one serving of fish per week, 1 8-ounce serving, what's the recommendation from the Great Lakes Consortium? So right here, back in 2019, they stated that, about 50 parts per billion is acceptable, and so that's the safe level. US EPA, similarly, around about a decade ago, I'll get back to this in a minute. So at that time, a decade ago, you would say that all of these fish are probably safe to eat, 1 serving per week. But over time, as we've learned more and more about these chemicals, these criteria, the safe level of consumption has declined over time. For example, the Great Lakes Consortium this year said, that's probably too high. We're going to revise our standard to this level right here, which means you could still eat, quite a few of these fish, but you want to be careful about king salmon. Michigan revised its standards as well, the state of Michigan, over a decade to about here. This is the European standard from 2020. So this is the European Food Safety Advisory. And the US EPA has never issued consumption advisories about fish for PFAS. But if you translate their water advisories, drinking water advisories to fish tissue, you can kind of estimate what that would be in terms of consumption. So the point is that these have declined over time to what is considered safe. But still, some of these fish have higher, some have lower, some are kind of in the middle. So this has evolved over time as we've learned more about these chemicals. But there's some good news. If you think, oh my goodness, every fish, I can't eat any fish. Well, that's not true. Let's think about this in terms of the tissues where we tend to find these chemicals. Not all tissues are created alike. So we know that PFAS are present in all the tissues of these larger fish that we've examined. And every fish we pulled out of Lake Michigan has detectable PFAS. But the PFAS levels are highest in the eggs right here, shown here. Let me animate that right there, and in tissues such as liver. So eggs that have a lot of protein in them, as albumin is laid down into the eggs, PFAS are being transferred from mother to eggs during development, and so they tend to be high. So probably not a good idea to eat salmon eggs, generally speaking. But it's actually lowest in muscle tissue. So this part of the plot right here, muscle, shows that PFAS, fortunately, are lowest in muscle tissue, which we're eating for the most part, than in the organ tissue. So the different organs are showed here: blood, gallbladder, gills, heart, kidney, liver, etc., and eggs sort of leading the pack. So it's not equally distributed in each one of the tissues. Unfortunately, it's lowest in the muscle that we tend to eat. Okay, I want to sort of put this in a little larger context here, and then sort of come back to a couple of take-home points. What we're thinking about now, and one of the reasons we're motivated to study this in Northwest Indiana, in the lake and the rivers that flow into Northwest Indiana, to try to get a handle on the PFAS cycle, which we sometimes refer to as the lake river PFAS cycle. So keep in mind that the fish, small fish that are going into Lake Michigan, salmonids, for example, are growing there, and that's where they're picking up their contaminants. They're not going into the lake contaminated. They're coming out of the lake contaminated. So they're picking up pollutants in Lake Michigan, not just PFAS, but other kinds of pollutants as well. And then some of those are being harvested in the lake, such as this king salmon here. So there's a little harvest signal right here. Okay, some proportion, as Rob mentioned, are being harvested there. Some of them are released, some of them are consumed. Some of them are going on the wall as trophy. But some of them are coming upriver to spawn. So it's not only Indiana, but Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois. Rivers, fish are going up and spawning in those rivers, as was described for the hatchery. That's basically what they're doing in the rivers too. Some of them are being harvested in the river as they come up by residents, and some of them are clearly being consumed after they're being fished out of the river. But the cycle becomes more interesting too, because they're also releasing eggs into the river as well. And these eggs, as I mentioned to you, have fairly high PFAS loads. These are being fed on by native species such as this brook trout right here. So this is a native trout in the Great Lakes region. And we know that they're feeding on these eggs because these eggs came right out of the stomach of these brook trout. These are little proteinaceous, lipid-rich morsels of energy. And so many organisms, many fish are feeding on these fish eggs after they've been released. Some of these then are being harvested, so that's kind of a indirect intake of PFAS through harvested riverine fish. And those carcasses over here, those migrating salmon and other species for that matter, many species migrate upriver, not just salmon. They're dying and decaying and then sometimes being scavenged by mammals as well. And so they're acquiring some of these PFAS compounds and other pollutants as well. So kind of bottom line is, how careful do we need to be when we're consuming Great Lakes fish? Well, we have to be realistic and we have to think about the benefits of fish protein. Right? I mean, we eat fish for a reason. It has high protein content. It has low fat content. It has omega-3 fatty acids that are good for us. It gives us micronutrients. But there are risks too that we have to weigh. And it's not just PFAS. We know that these fish are carrying PFAS in their tissues, but there are other contaminants as well. There are PCBs, now phased out, but still in the environment because they're very persistent. So PFAS are kind of the PCBs of decades ago. There's mercury and other contaminants as well. So, you really need to think about the cost-benefit ratio for you personally. There are risk categories that we have to acknowledge too: young children, pregnant women, those that have underlying health effects should be cognizant of the risk that they take when they consume fish that have any of these contaminants in them. And ultimately, it's a personal decision about whether you decide to eat or not and how much you decide to do. So what do we see moving forward? So a really bright undergraduate at Notre Dame decided to acquire all the information he could find on the amount of PFAS in biota, any kind of organism, plant, animal, microbe, whatever you could find from the Great Lakes, and then analyze that whole batch of data to see what the trends are over time. And so this shows only PFAS, that one sort of legacy chemical that's been around for like 50 years. And so this is the trend of only PFAS over time. And the thing to note is around 2002, we knew PFAS was bad, and industry phased it out voluntarily. They just said, okay, we're going to take it out of all products and not produce any more PFAS, not put it into stain-resistant carpet and food packaging and all these other things that it was used for, or firefighting foams for that matter. And so it was phased out. So the thing to notice is be fortunate, be happy we don't live in Lake Ontario. Number one, because this is the trend in Lake Ontario, which is at the end of the Great Lakes, right? So it gets everything moving from Lake Superior all the way through the Great Lakes, finally ends up in Lake Ontario, including persistent organic compounds like these pollutants. And so this is the PFAS phase out. So notice over time kind of dips a little bit, but then, oh, good, declining in Lake Ontario. So that's good news for Lake Ontario, for these PFAS and for other PFAS as well. Lake Erie, again, like the second from the end, just above Lake Ontario, gets everything from its other lakes. It, shows some swings and then, an increase, but then over time in the last couple of decades, it's declining as well. Huron is over here, the next one kind of swings down a little bit enough. Lake Michigan, this is in relatively good condition compared to these other lakes in terms of at least PFAS. It's down here close to Lake Superior, but it's flat. It's just sort of flat, so it has sort of overall, low levels of PFAS contamination relative to these other systems, but pretty steady over time. Then Lake Superior, the highest in the system, the cleanest lake, the coldest lake, has relatively low PFAS concentrations, but still detectable. It's not like we're out of the woods here, but it's lower than these other systems. So, I think fortunately we live in the Lake Michigan watershed rather than over here. But, the trends over time, no problems. Okay, a few take-home points from Dr. Zachritz and my presentation. So we know that, we're exposed to PFAS on a regular basis. This can be occupational, for example, if you're a firefighter, you're going to be exposed to more than if you're not. It's in our drinking water, so, we have to think about the water that we drink. And we're exposed to our diet as well if we consume those materials, those food sources that have PFAS. As Alison mentioned, in Northwest Indiana, really anywhere, wastewater treatment plants are a source because this PFAS just goes right through the wastewater treatment plant. It is not degraded like many other contaminants are, just super persistent. Industry produces these chemicals and releases them. Airports, firefighting foam for the most part, and transported atmospherically. We know that PFAS are found in all Lake Michigan fish that at least we've analyzed and others have as well. But concentrations really vary, depending on the species, the type of tissue, and also where the habitat of those organisms. So although they're present, they can be low or they can be higher in some cases. PFAS are present in all Lake Michigan and it's connecting tributaries, we know this. But the glimmer of hope is that these concentrations appear to be dropping overall in the Great Lakes over time. And right now, Michigan is slightly higher than Superior, but not nearly as bad as some of the other lakes.